Good evening, everyone. My name is Natal. I'm a law student, and today with me we have Dr. Randall S. Bach, MD. And today we're going to discuss some of the questions regarding the origins of the Zika endemic in Brazil. Let's hear what Dr. Bach has to say. S- So,
Uh,
Doctor, I have some questions for you. Do you want to say something before we start,
no,
or?
no, no. I, I think I just jumped the gun. Thank you so much. I think it's a. I'll just give my quick intro. Is I think it's been a fascinating story to find out about. Um, I read a lot of comic books when I was young, Superman and Batman and Spider-Man a little bit, and inevitably it was the origin stories that got me interested. I mean, they're not real, but they were fascinating anyway. I mean, I thought they were sort of real. Batman, his parents were brutalized, and he went after criminals after that. Superman was an orphan from another planet, and he had superpowers, and he could be affected by the remnants of his old planet, and so forth and so on. So origin stories, I think, have a particular fascination, and wherever this story goes, the origin story is a thing in and of itself. I mean, a lot of times we just hear the word Zika now, and it's relatively familiar. We hear Zika microcephaly, and those words seem to go together. And certainly, if you Google them together, you'll find hundreds of thousands of links and tens of thousands of articles. But it wasn't always that way, and I think it's hard, particularly for younger people and Brazilians, to remember a time when those things were not connected, and how they got to be connected, and how Zika became a familiar word is an interesting story, and it involves people, and it involves intrigue, and it involves a fair amount of moving around and connections, and that has fascinated me, I have to say.
Okay, perfect. So, Doctor, my first question for you tonight is once again about the origins of Zika. What can you tell us about the discovery of Zika back in Africa? When it all began, per se?
Well, um, you know, there are many, many viruses, um, and viruses have been around probably longer than humans. And they infect all different kinds of animals, and there are multiple different kinds of viruses. And in a simple way, viruses are like, I think we discussed this previously, they're basically hijackers. So they will come in, and I think the example I used was a robot factory. If you're making robots, some new robot comes in, doesn't want you to make Roombas. It wants to make you some, I don't know, murderous robot instead, and takes over all the other robots, and anyway, changes the factory and start making its own thing. But basically all they come down to, they're little bits of genetic material, either DNA or RNA, and they take over the blueprints of what we like to make, and they make what they like to make. So that's viruses in a way. And obviously we have COVID now. That's a virus we're all scared of. Um, but so the origin story of Zika is far longer than we can provide. The real question is when we encountered it, and what it has been in our consciousness. So all these viruses, one form or another, or malaria, bacteria, they've all been around, and they have been infecting animals and um, um, any type of life form, even plants, can get infections and whatnot. So it's nothing new Zika is not a new thing. The real question would be, when did we find it? And that apparently was 1947 in Uganda's Zika forest. There have been other viruses that preceded Zika's being found. We've heard of influenza and smallpox and herpes, and there are lots of other viruses that people cared about and paid attention to in advance of caring about and paying attention to Zika. So I would imagine that a fair number of parasitologists or infectious disease tropical experts at certain tropical area medical schools, and maybe others, knew about Zika before I did, before most other physicians. But I can tell you for a fact that we didn't study it in medical school back in the 1970s and 80s. And I don't think any of my cohort, younger physician friends, had heard about it either. when it came into the news in 2015 and 2016. I think, again, probably some experts knew about it. It's apparent travel from parts of Asia, potentially to the Americas. But the question I would have is why had we heard about it so late? I mean, we know, we hear now a lot about the 1918 Spanish flu, and influenza was clearly known about in 1918. So what took so long for people to not, another 30 years or so before people even heard about Zika, and then another 65 years or so before anyone really cared about it? Well, the answer is that it doesn't really do anything to us historically. It may do something to primates. I don't really know. They don't come into doctors' offices and complain about stuff like that. And clearly, there has to be some coexistence between animals today and viruses today. If viruses did something so dangerous to the animals to wipe them out, then they wouldn't have any other animals on which to feast and host later on, unless they could find some jump to some other animal. So the fact that it was found late is probably an indication that it wasn't that much of a thing, or as far as humans are concerned. I don't say that absolutely, because HIV was found relatively late and probably has similar origins in Africa. As does dengue, by the way, origins in Africa. And a fair number of viruses probably originate in Africa, because most likely humans themselves originate in Africa, along with a fair amount of other vertebrate animals and invertebrates and so forth, because Africa is a warm tropical place, and that's apparently where life started. Life didn't start in Antarctica. Life may have migrated to certain places, but you don't see that much life, and clearly warmer temperatures and tropical sun and so forth tend to incubate all kinds of kind of a more interesting biological brew than ice can, cold. And that I think makes a fair amount of physical sense as well as biologic. So Zika had been around, but way, way, way under any kind of medical radar for decades. At the time that it was found in Brazil, is again the origin story I'd like to get to. It was found in 1947 very incidentally, and then throughout the 1960s and 70s, so forth, 50s, I guess, it wasn't really found. I mean, it was found in Nigeria and certain other places in Africa, but it wasn't really doing anything. So it didn't become a matter of medical concern. Even today in Africa, malaria is a very big problem. That's a plasmodium. That's not a virus or bacterium. But it is similarly transmitted by mosquitoes, and a lot of the prevention, for malaria is what dominates, keeping some of the other potential, we call them arboviruses, arthropod-borne viruses, that is, viruses that travel by mosquito, pretty much. Keep those in check. So, humans have made a lot of progress in the tropics because they've been able to keep mosquito populations down. In the places where they have not, progress or human civilization has been delayed or slowed. In order to build the Panama Canal, for instance, I think Walter Reed, for whom there's a hospital complex in Washington, D.C. by the U.S. government, I think first thing he did was figure out yellow fever came from and through mosquitoes. And the workers who worked on the Panama Canal had no chance of building it until they figured out that particular fact, and then went for mosquito control, and then figuring out the lifespan of mosquitoes, of the life cycle of mosquitoes through swampy areas and whatnot. So there had to be a lot of drainage before there could be any kind of construction work and or predominant civilization outside of, say, certain very carved out areas in the tropics. So, diseases and particularly mosquito-borne diseases are a big part of the history, one presumes, of Brazil and other tropical countries as well. So it was there, but I have to say, Zika is part of the family of flaviviruses, of which I think there are known, maybe 54, I don't know, somewhere in the dozens of viruses, and probably others we haven't come around yet to. we only really know as physicians, we only really know or care about certain of them. I think there's West Nile virus, yellow fever I've mentioned already. Hepatitis C is the biggest member of that family, and that in any given moment on Earth probably infects maybe 50 to 100 million people, usually without symptoms, and no microcephaly, mind you. And dengue is Zika's kind of closest relative, and Zika and dengue are almost essentially the same thing. They don't really appear any different under the electron, microscope. There's a lot of pairing between one and the other. I would kind of maybe compare it to a zebra and a horse. I'm not sure they can mate. But they, if you see a zebra, if you called a zebra a striped horse, you wouldn't be that far off. I think Zika and dengue have similarities on that level. So they're not precisely the same thing genetically, but they do almost the same thing. They probably, look inside their mouths, they wouldn't be able to tell one from the other.
Okay, doctor, thank you. That was a nice introduction. Can we move on to the second one?
Sure.
So, from a medical perspective, why was researching Zika when it was first discovered important? What I mean is Zika wasn't, the big deal back then when it was right now. From a medical perspective, a researcher's perspective, why should we research new viruses?
Well, I'm not saying, that's begging the question. I don't know that necessarily we should. It's impossible. I mean, knowledge is wonderful. It's nice to explore the universe, insofar as we can. We have probes and so forth out in space, and we've got, all kind, we send, rockets to Mars and whatnot, and we can see all kinds of nebulae and other galaxies and so forth all throughout, the universe. Now, very few of those are going to affect your day one way or another. I think it's insofar as we have the luxury, in a sense, to figure out, how, various nebulae and things. There's certain repetition to them, though. Once you've seen a star, you've seen a star. Once you've seen a nebula, I know they vary from each other. They vary in the distance, but the actual chemical process between one star and another star is not that different. And as far as how they affect us, not that much. I would say that for many, many viruses, again, of all the flaviviruses, the dozens, that we don't talk about, and for good reason, because they don't affect us. I think that's a natural thing. It might be wonderful at some point, to get the genome of all of them and, I don't know, have them a museum of viruses or something like that. So if you really cared about that, but, there's so much knowledge about so many arcane topics. We don't have the time, the ability, or the luxury to kind of have them all in knowledge at any given moment. So we tend to, follow and care about the ones that we need to. And there can be some overlap, as I was mentioning with malaria. If we took care of yellow fever and malaria by virtue of cutting down, mosquito populations and/or having mosquito protection, mosquito netting, and whatnot, we will have a healthier population, and presuming that's what we want. And along the way, you'll have less dengue, and you'll have less Zika or whatever else. West Nile, they all go, hand in hand. We don't need to know the other, 35 flaviviruses right off the bat, off the top of our head. And again, I went through medical school not knowing Zika either. I think that's perfectly fine. I treated thousands of patients over dozens of years, and it never became an issue that I had never heard of Zika. If Zika is a thing that is causing microcephaly, then obviously has its own issues and will bring its own testing and bring, come into our consciousness, as has COVID now. But between the time of SARS-1 in 2003 and SARS-2 in 2019, we didn't really need to know or think much about the SARS coronaviruses either. I think there was one case of MERS, which was related in the Middle East in 2009 or so. But beyond that, I don't think, most physicians, even in Brazil and so forth, would need to really keep that much in mind about those other things. So, it's a little bit like the locust analogy. Locusts, I don't think they trouble us the same way they used to, because I think people have figured out how to control locusts. but a lot of people would not think about them in the 17 years between one infestation and the other. Does that reflect poorly on us? No, that's just, we have to do the things we have to do, and we have to attend to things we have to attend. There's, probably 50, 80, 100 things that you'll attend to between now and next Tuesday that are more important than, knowing when locusts are going to come out, because they're not bothering you and they're not even your problem. There's nothing you can do about it. Anyway, I don't know if that answers the question. I hope so.
Yeah, it was an interesting overview. Okay, so it was more of a complementary question to the next one.
Sure.
So let's move to the third question. So at first, I believe we discussed this last time, Zika was considered to be a mild disease, to the eyes of the media, maybe. So even global health authorities, they did not raise alarms about Zika. I want to ask you why and when did that change?
Okay. Well, I'd like to separate your question slightly. So, as I've said before, when something becomes a problem, it's a problem, obviously. So, coronaviruses were not a problem till 2003 SARS in China and a few other places. And then it became not a problem. And then it is a problem. So there can be an on-off switch for, problems. As far as Zika's being a problem, it came into our consciousness, world consciousness, really in 2015. There had been some consciousness of it by tropical disease experts, at other times. So, I've looked at the literature, the medical literature, quite a bit, and I forget the number of articles, but maybe a few dozen articles on Zika between 1947 and all the way up to, say, the 2000s. Starting around 2007, there was some experience with Zika in the South Pacific and the Western Pacific. And we mentioned previously the island of Yap. There was supposedly a syndrome of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a kind of an autoimmune problem after infection with a virus, not specific to Zika, mind you. You can get Guillain-Barré after influenza and after, I think, the measles and so forth. I think the concept is that your immune system has seen a new intruder and reacts to it, comes up with a kind of a mental image of what that intruder looks like, and mistakes some part of your body for the intruder and attacks it. So, I've got a nice dog, and he's pretty aggressive towards the mailman. When he's out and about and he sees somebody else in that same uniform who's not our mailman, he still gets angry at that guy, and he's making a mistake because he's not. Or maybe he's not, I don't know. But, there's some, say, bleed over between one thing and another. So Guillain-Barré syndrome is a kind of a paralysis, hopefully temporary. And people noticed some cases of that, and they noticed some Zika in the South Pacific, as I said. So people were associating one from the other, but it's not a direct result of an illness. It's not like, again, COVID causing a pneumonia. You have COVID, you have a pneumonia at the same time. So Guillain-Barré is a kind of a late sequelae, again, of a number of viral syndromes. And they thought maybe this was Zika because they were noticing Zika where they hadn't before. I don't think that is necessarily proof because, again, Guillain-Barré is very nonspecific. And just because something has shown up doesn't mean that is the problem. I think we can, make that mistake a lot of different ways between correlation and causation. I was joking with a friend the other day that this time of year, it's becoming springtime, it's getting warmer. All of a sudden, and it hasn't been for months, all of a sudden near my house, I hear these motorcycles, going by, and they make a pretty loud noise. We're fairly near a main street. And I thought, oh, it's spring. I really, in the back of my head, I thought, oh, it's springtime. It's better weather now. and my kind of like animal superstitious brain was like, had associated this sound of motorcycles with like good times, like warmer weather, like we were cooped up, it's cold, it's freezing. But now I hear the motorcycles going by, I'm like, oh, and in a sense, the guys on the motorcycles, they're feeling great, they're out, it's good weather, and I hear them going, but it's not as if they caused the good weather. So if every year, when the first thing you hear is the motorcycles, then the weather gets great, it's easy to make that association. But the commonality that the motorcycle is coming out because of the good weather and the good weather doesn't mean that one brought the other. I mean, if anything, the good weather brought the motorcycles, but the motorcycles didn't bring the good weather. And so with Zika on the island of Yap, there was Guillain-Barré syndrome, and so people have had this association that somehow it's a neurotoxic problem because Guillain-Barré is an autoimmune problem towards the neurologic system. But I don't think that necessarily says anything for the virus itself being neurotoxic. It's more our antibody reaction to it, which gets diverted and wrongly picks out some part of the nervous system. Tell me if that helped. Did that help answer the question at all?
Yeah, it did.
Okay.
Let me see. Okay, so now we're moving on to the fourth one. All right. So, do you believe that there are other diseases that may somehow go under our radar and they may be associated with serious symptoms in the future?
Well, I mean, obviously, yes. We've seen that in the past. Again, just with COVID, coronavirus, as something that, coronaviruses themselves are 1 out of 6 of every common cold we get historically. And so all of us have had coronaviruses before. But is there a new one? Well, viruses are, mutating all the time, and they have a kind of an easier way of mutating because they make so many of them. And if they make a mistake mutation that doesn't help them, that hurts them in some way, then they fall off. So imagine an automobile has, I don't know how many parts, a couple thousand parts in an automobile, and they all get made a certain way. I think we discussed this a little bit with the iPhone last time. Most everything you're going to do, if it's a mistake as you're making that car, are going to make the car worse. And so they don't drive as well. People won't be buying them. They're not going to be reproduced and so forth. If somebody comes along with a mistake on a car that somehow makes it drive faster, quieter, whatever, then that mistake will be more popular. And so that's kind of the way mutations work. They don't work through any causality or consciousness on the part of the viruses. And since they make so many copies, they make, I don't know, I forget, they probably make billions of copies every time they infect one of us. One of them, as these replications happen, can be different. And so every virus, the reason, Zika is related to dengue and so forth, is probably they all came from some common precursor, and they've kind of slightly mutated. And so there's a little difference, again, the zebra and the horse, a few differences between them. A horse is not a zebra, but they all probably have some pre-horse or pre-horse zebra from which they both came. So there are going to be some other ones that are, going to theoretically mutate from other things. There is a kind of a bandwidth. I think people should not go super crazy about viruses or other infectious things, agents in general, because there has to be, in a sense, a balance between the viruses, and I say this very broadly because viruses don't have brains, bacteria don't have brains, between their needs and our needs. A virus that is so super great at killing you does not wind up propagating because it burns out its own household. So if there was a guy who wanted to live in your neighborhood, but every time he set foot in a house, the house burned down, other people would kind of group around it really quickly. They'd isolate him, they move away, or he'd burn out his neighborhood, and then there'd be no jump. So the best kind of virus, the best kind of infectious agent is one that doesn't hugely damage the host and just sees the host as a vehicle to get to the next place. And so more like a bus. You don't do that well blowing up the bus if you want buses to kind of help your kids and your family travel in 5 years from now. The idea, you still want buses to be there. So they see us as their vehicle, their transport between this generation virus and the next. And they don't think or see, but that's the way it works out. So there has to be, a little bit of balance. Like a really severe virus like Ebola does not travel that well because people are aware of it. So, the problems are so grave. People are dropping dead and they're having hemorrhages and whatnot that everyone else like runs away from them, and people wind up kind of literally burning the area. And so the virus burns out, the area burns out, the people have burned out, and that's the end of it for the most part. And again, it can crop up in other places and whatnot. So most of your viruses are going to wind up being ones that will potentially make you ill. So you notice because something's happening, your body's being diverted from its normal task to making virus. So you're going to feel sick because instead of making more you and more things that you want to do, energy for your body to run around and make new cells and be happy and all that kind of stuff, all of a sudden your factories have been diverted, at least for the next few days, to doing something at somebody else's bidding. So you're going to feel sick and miserable. But generally speaking, not so horribly so. Now that of course varies from virus to virus, and the HIV is probably the worst virus to come around ever. But even so, it can be rather indolent. We don't, it can be quiet in people for some time. It's kind of its own special case because it's so almost nearly uniformly lethal since recent treatment. That it is in a sense like the Ebola, but it's a that is, I think, the worst virus. I think it's far worse than COVID, Zika, or anything else like that. So just why don't you give me the question again so I can see if I missed any part of it.
Okay, so my question was if there are other diseases, not necessarily viruses, that go under our radar, and in the future they may somehow mutate, develop, and become a problem.
Right. Well, okay. So I think I covered that fairly well. The answer is yes, but I think within a certain bandwidth of problem. I do think that COVID has been really. I know Brazil's having a rather rough time with it right now, but overall, I think people lose sight of the fact that if you have a normal functioning, healthy, young immune system, it is not really a disease problem, with rare exceptions. Obviously, some people young have died from it, but the median age almost across the world is around 80 years old. That is to say that even though that represents a tiny bit of your overall population, I think less than 2% of any country's population is over 80. That's about 50% of the deaths. So it's a force multiplier in the elderly. And so there may be illnesses on that level, but for the most part, they're not going to be affecting the human species as a whole, because the young healthy people who are the ones reproducing and carrying forth society are not really affected at all by COVID. I know when I say at all, there's a little asterisk, obviously sometimes, but there's about a 1,000 to a 10,000-fold risk factor between your 85-year-old in a nursing home, that person's susceptibility to ICU level and or death versus, say, a average 12 or 15-year-old. So the people who are young and healthy and have their intact immune systems, they don't really, they'll get COVID, they won't really even notice symptoms. So insofar as things come around, I just like to calm people down about the next pandemic. Yes, there can be something, but one of the worst parts about pandemics in general is our reaction to them, and potentially our overreaction to them. I think, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president in the 1940s in the United States, and 30s as well, said that, the greatest thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he was talking about war and Nazis and whatnot, but he also meant that we can't demoralize ourselves over a potential threat and lose sight of the fact that our strength is necessary to maintain ourselves against that threat, and that if we become fearful, we wind up having reactions that are not necessarily helpful to our society and ourselves. And so this is very important. It's something I think a theme that carries through with COVID clearly, and as well with the earlier pandemic of Zika. And that's a point I'd like to come back to, but let's see if we can move on.
All right. Thank you again, Doc. So, okay. Uh, this is more of a personal question. My question is, what's your biggest criticism of the conclusions made by Brazilian doctors regarding Zika?
Well, it's always, we have an expression, until you walk a mile or a kilometer to 1.6 kilometers in somebody else's shoes, you should not criticize them. So I don't want this broadcast or this effort to criticize people in their situations at the time, because I think it's one of the real problems that our current society has, that is that we are what I would call acontextual, which means that we take things without considering the context of which people were operating at that time. So, I mean, we see it a lot. We say, George Washington, one of the founders of our country, perhaps the principal, he had slaves. And so they say, oh, well, he was a bad person. He had slaves. At the same time that the formation of the Union was, slavery clearly was an issue and a divisive one, and people did consider it at that time. And it's very hard, the one person who can get up and yell and make things, people aware of some problem they have, is not necessarily the person who winds up forming a union or leading. And people hopefully get to a better place. I don't think we are perfect in everything we do now either, and some things will be seen contextually very, as a challenge. People, without getting political, there are people in favor of abortion, there are people against abortion. But wherever that issue goes, the people on one side or the other will be seen as having been wrong in their own context. So as far as these physicians go and figuring out their context, I think there are some issues and problems that I've noticed, and I'd like to go, a little bit more in depth with writing than over on this show. But there were basically two phases of what I'll call the origin story, the Zika discovery story, and I think it's fascinating, and I'd be happy to take questions on this and address it again, probably more in writing, because A, I'm not an expert, and B, it's pretty complicated. But maybe I can just go to an article to crib a little bit here and help show the issue. So this is an article from Newsweek magazine, March 11th, 2016, and I think it pretty nicely goes over the two phases of the discovery. So just very briefly, the first phase is right here. And again, it points up the confusion with dengue, zebras and horses, that these Zika and dengue are almost the same thing. At the time, and I've mentioned this before, there was no testing for Zika in Brazil, except potentially at some research level institutions, and only if they were able to import the primer, which I believe they did at the time from Singapore. I'm possibly mistaken on that, but so there was nobody testing at this time, that in early 2015, when there was a suspicion that there could be a new dengue-like illness. So here they first mention Aedes aegypti, which obviously is a mosquito whose origin is probably African as well, Egypt. Things have traveled around the world. Now it's endemic in Brazil. It's a mosquito. It's basically all over the country. And then there's an annual epidemic of dengue that kills hundreds, sometimes thousands. They've learned to live with dengue. But here we go. In the first months of 2015, they began to see what they believed was a new mosquito-borne illness. It tended to cause flu-like symptoms, a light fever, and a pinkish rash that disappeared in a day or two. This is not malaria. It's not even dengue. It's not COVID. It's not HIV. It's not Ebola. A level issue. It's a problem that is barely there. A light fever, and so forth. And again, probably young, healthy people maybe not even have known they had it. Most local healthcare workers in Brazil we're treating it as though we're dengue. And dengue can have variable appearance. It can be, what's called break bone fever, which feels as if somebody's, hammering your bones and cracking them, but it can also be mild. So, why this had not to be dengue, I don't know. But here we go. But when Dr. Kleber Luz, an infectious disease expert based in Natal, looked at the symptoms, he quickly suspected it was not dengue. And he called up a colleague, Dr. Carlos Brito, at Fiocruz in Pernambuco, and they discussed this. And then say here, we collected more than 500 samples. I'm not sure of what, I assume blood samples. And we insisted it was not dengue. There was something urgent and new. Now, again, I don't want to be, again, like I said, taking people in the wrong time and context. But I don't know how this follows that it had to be something urgent and new. I don't know why it couldn't be dengue, which is there, and why it had to be Zika, which is almost indistinguishable from dengue on a biologic basis, and even with testing. So I'm not sure how they made that diagnosis. And it goes on here a little bit the history I already given, which is Zika has been known in decades in Africa and parts of Asia, but it had never spread in South America. So, at this time, they come up with this concept, and they'd probably read some of the journals that had come out of YAP, in the previous few years about Guillain-Barré syndrome. So if they were infectious disease experts, not me, not a primary care doctor, they might have seen the word Zika, and they might suspect, well, it's in the South Pacific, why not here? And this is kind of a leap in a couple different ways. Physically, it's a leap because YAP is not Brazil. So you have to leap thousands of miles and lots of water and no easy transport, even for a mosquito. And it's been a little bit of a stretch, I would say. And I've read, a fair amount of this. I'm referencing, in this case, some people who have done even more research. In this case, Donald McNeil's book on Zika from around that same time. And even now, or from that, they can't firmly conclude how it got there, how it got to Brazil. And I'm not even, on one level, I'm not going to sound conspiratorial, but I have some question and doubt whether it did travel as they say. It could be that there is a Zika type thing in Brazil, but it could just be that, some natural local dengue, branched off into some natural local Zika, or things that they're calling Zika, because it's similar to other things they've called Zika elsewhere. And there are multiple strains of Zika, and I want to put that out. Just there are like 3 or 4 major strains of dengue. I think there are 3 or 4 strains of Zika as well. And they can do genetic testing. They can follow some of these around. And I think there is thought that the Asia strain, the South Pacific Asia strain, wound up in Zika. But this happened much later. At the time that Kleber Luz and Carlos Brito were hypothesizing that Zika was in Brazil, there was no test for it. And none of the patients had been tested for Zika. And that they made this presumption was solely on a clinical basis, that they were finding kind of mild dengue or potentially Zika. So this is an issue. I think, this is maybe, my judging a little bit. I think there is some fascination with finding something new. Again, getting back to the stars in the sky, if Neto Locio finds a star up there, or some new crater on the moon that nobody found, you get to name it, and forever that is that's got your name on it. Now, in the case of Zika, it doesn't have their names on it per se, but their names are associated, and they, physicians and researchers do, get, in particular research, get ahead in the world of research by production, by articles, and by lecturing, and by association with something new and different. So I think that there's the potential for some reward for having a new diagnosis, even though it's very, very dengue-like and probably indistinguishable from dengue, both on a clinical, medical, observational basis and on a diagnostic basis. And again, at the time was literally indistinguishable because there was no testing for it. So they made a leap just almost as big as the one that potentially the Zika virus made from South Pacific to Brazil. They made a mental leap in claiming that this was Zika when Zika had never ever been found in Brazil and couldn't actually be proven to have been found in Brazil at that time. But once that was, so that's part one, and then part two, and again, this goes into a lot more interesting detail with the facts on the ground, the actual origin story. So I'm just covering it very loosely. But part two, so it was once this was posited, I think some physicians believed it, and some physicians didn't. And I think in the major academic institutions, I think there was a fair amount of doubt that there had to be Zika. Like, why did there have to be new Zika when dengue could be doing this? A, and B, it wasn't causing any problems. Again, it wasn't malaria, it wasn't HIV, it wasn't Ebola, and it wasn't COVID. It was something that at worst was causing a light rash. Like, why would we necessarily care? Why do we need a new name for something? Why can't it just be mild dengue? And again, even if it were Zika, it's pretty much dengue anyway. Why? But I don't know. I can't answer that. I mean, I'd be interested to hear the reasons from the doctors themselves, and maybe we can invite them at some point to come on and explain why it had to be something new when that clearly couldn't be proven. But be that as it may, so it's out there. I think it acquired a little bit of cachet. What's the word for that? Kind of like a little bit of allure, a little bit of sparkle, attraction for other people, other physicians, because it's new. Everybody likes new trends. We all want to know new styles, new songs, new dances, new this, new that. And this was a new disease, and it's kind of got. I think it's got a cool name. Zika is a cool name. It's short, it's easy to remember, and it's maybe a little more exciting than dengue. I don't know, but it wasn't until later that year, I believe in the fall of 2015, totally different problem. There were some neuropediatricians in Recife, who believed that they were seeing more microcephaly in clinic. And again, this is its own kind of deep issue, which I can only touch on here. But they thought there were higher numbers in the clinics. But again, this is its own kind of separate but similar problem, because just as there couldn't be proven Zika at the time that they said it was Zika, there couldn't be proven that there was more microcephaly in Recife because there had been no registry of prior years. And on top of that, there is no firm usage of what the term microcephaly means. And again, we've covered some of this, but Brazil, how do we know this? Because Brazil itself, I think, changed the qualifications for what they considered microcephaly. I know at least once, I think twice. And then they're not, different worldwide standards. There's a lot of debate about this after the fact, about whether those standards are applied correctly. If a standard for one group, again, kind of in this case, the European, southeastern Brazilians, taller and whatnot, are applied to the Indios, populations in poorer sections of Recife, who are smaller physically and have potentially more prematurity based on poverty and whatnot. And the fact that microcephaly, is a couple different things. There's classic microcephaly, which is a genetic, autosomal recessive genetic illness with classic problems. It has nothing to do with Zika or anything else. It's a genetic problem, Mendelian genetic problem, just like being an albino. It's not, being an albino is not a virus. It's not pesticides. It's not toxins. It's not syphilis. It's a genetic mistake, in a sense, that matches up between two parents. You got an albino. There's nothing you can do about it. Anyway, there's true microcephaly, which is like that. And then there's a whole bunch of other things, which basically relatively small heads. And it depends where you draw the line. And again, I don't want to go back over having covered this before, but that's part of the problem. And so there was a couple different issues here wherein this connection got made. Now, if they just said, oh my God, there's more microcephaly, we think, we need to go find out how much microcephaly there was in previous years and prove this, that would have been one thing, but that did not happen. If they had said, oh, we're seeing this type of microcephaly, and they had a specific syndrome, but that didn't happen either. But what did happen was, again, this is part of the origin story we talked about, but doctors Vanderlyn, and I think there are 3 neuropediatricians in the same family, a mother, her 2 offspring, a son and a daughter. They're all neuropediatricians, and they all wind up having this amongst themselves. They communicated at least in different, 2 different cities, and some other physicians wound up being on a network, a WhatsApp network, which originally was called CHKV, which is was abbreviated for chikungunya virus WhatsApp group. And so these are people who are trying to attribute, potential problems or uptick in symptoms to chikungunya, which is a toga virus, different in size, shape, and formation from the flaviviruses that are dengue and Zika, amongst others. But I believe is a doctor, an OBGYN named Adriano Melo, who had concluded, had some amniotic fluid tested for either dengue or Zika, and found that positive, and made the thought that maybe Zika, and maybe I'm not even sure whether it showed Zika or dengue, but again, it came out to be Zika, could get into the babies, and then Dr. Vanderlyn saw these microcephaly cases, and again, one particular moment she saw twins, and one was abnormal, the other was normal, and why that made her, conclude. But she said that was her eureka moment, where she decided it had to be something infectious, and I guess Zika was the what we call the new kid on the block. It was a new thing, and because Zika was new and this was happening, she made the conclusion that one was from the other. Now, this may be absolutely correct, but even if something's absolutely correct, if it's damaging and if it's going to affect a lot of people, you should make very sure that's the case early on. I'm reading the Donald McNeil book, as I mentioned, and I'll just try to reference it quickly here, because he mentions the proof. And let's see, I try to do this really fast. What do I want to do? I share my screen, and I'm going to find the Kindle. Can I find it? Yeah. Oops. So I'm going to share it with us. Can you see this? Yes.
Yes.
So chapter 10 is the proof, and I can't make this any bigger easily, so I'll read part of this.
Can you press Control Plus on your keyboard?
Well, Kindle doesn't work. Kindle doesn't work exactly the same, because this is not online. This is kind of in my book form. So okay. I could probably do this, change the size of the type, but I don't think I'm going to have time right now to do it. So it says initially, Bruce Aylward, who I think is CDC in the United States, gave the same answer. They want a large case control study to prove this. They want the proof. They want a large case control study. And so we're just going to skip through here. What led the agencies to change their minds about waiting for the big study? A series of small studies. And it goes over some, various small studies of a dozen patients here, a few dozen patients, less than 100 here. And so again, I'm not going to read all this, but rather than test all their subjects, they had chosen rashes as the recruitment factor. So they had nobody with Zika tested. What they did was they chose people with rashes. And then after that, they tested them for Zika. This is after finding out they had rashes. This is a problem with a study formation, and I'm going to stop sharing this for now. But I would have to go in this a little bit more deeply in this kind of theoretical stuff. But you can, if you choose the wrong group, and you choose a group based on what your feelings about something are, you're going to get probably more likely the answer you want to get than if you do it on a random basis. I mean, how would I test this? I mean, if I were curious about whether Brazilians knew constitutional law, I could go randomly, in a lot of different ways, and come across people on the street. I could stand in front of a department store and ask people if they knew, Article 2 of the Brazilian Constitution. Probably most people would say, I have no idea. Or what if I happen to stand right outside of a law school, and I just randomly ask people coming in and out of a law school. I mean, maybe I don't even know it's a law school. Maybe I do. And I ask them, what's Article 2 of the Brazilian Constitution? And 80% of people know. I'd be like, wow, Brazilians are so awesome. They know Article 2 of the Brazilian Constitution, and it's just like a random bunch of people. But where I put myself determines the answers I get. So if I put myself in the Amazonian jungle and I ask the same question, I'm going to get a different answer, or a different proportion of people who know something. And I could do the same thing with soccer scores, whatever. If I'm outside a bar where, on Sunday afternoon or something like that, after a soccer game, I ask people what's who's the best player in Brazil or something, I'll get very knowledgeable answers. If I go, I don't know, to a street corner where I am in Massachusetts, I might not get the same level of answers. So selection of your bunch determines what you get. I just think that the reason the CDC, the United States, was Center for Disease Control, asked for large case control studies before they made a determination was that's the thing to do. That's how you decide things on a scientific basis, especially if you want to turn the world upside down for a while and have pregnancies prevented, try to change, the social order in Brazil, abortion laws and legal challenges and all kinds of issues. If you want to do all that, there should be some good rationale for it. And again, whether Zika caused microcephaly, whether Zika is there, I can't fully comment because those are things beyond what I can do from my seat here. But the fact of the matter is that the way they decided it was not on a full scientific basis, and they did not do it the way you have to do it if you want to prove things scientifically, which is ideally double-blinded case studies or case control study. But something that's done in advance with the observers trying to get as neutral as they can be, to get out of the selection process and to have things happen organically, and then you are observing, comparisons. So if you want to, see which seed make bigger tomatoes, you don't let the farmer know. You put it in certain places where you don't know either where they are. There's some secret code. And then you can come back and examine the tomatoes based on the same watering, the same, sun, the same circuit, if they're, same circuits, and you notice a difference, then you can start to conclude. And even if you do make that conclusion, you really have to do it again, and multiple times. If you do it multiple times, you find the same thing where you move the tomatoes around, do different farmers, different places, then you can say, this seed makes a bigger tomato. But a lot of things happen on a random basis. One bad seed from a tomato plant doesn't mean that all the seeds from that, bunch are bad. You can get caught up in variations and make those as if those are decisive when in fact they are just coincidental and they can lead you astray. So in this case, for the Zika microcephaly origin story, there were two separate parts, I think both of which were weak and both of which had no correlation with actual Zika testing at the time, and there were various issues about kind of what I call personal desires or personal wishes potentially changing the way things were formed, the ideas were formed, and the conclusions.
Okay, thanks, Doc. So for sixth question, I want to ask you, considering the damage that are caused by scientific proof made on isolated assumptions, what do you believe that can be done to correct this sort of mistakes, to correct the misinformation within the scientific community?
Well, this is the easy answer is that science is really a matter of debate. I mean, you should understand debate you are studying law, and cases get adjudicated. So did Joseph kill this person? Well, the evidence says this, and certain evidence says that. It has to be figured out. With science, there's no real court. There's no firm decision. But I know what doesn't help. What doesn't help is closing off debate. Now, people will say a lot of things, and some people are conspiracy theorists, and sometimes with an accepted narrative, with an accepted thought, that people will decide that that is the only thing it can be, and if you don't think that, you are X, and usually it's got somebody's going to call you a bad name in one way or another if you don't follow along with certain ideas. I think that science, oftentimes here we hear the term settled science. I don't know if you've heard that kind of phrase in Portuguese, but people say it's settled science that, and then whatever I happen to believe at this moment, whatever is politically expedient for me to promulgate. There is no such thing as settled science. Newton was pretty good, and he had all kinds of ideas. And I think on a macro level, on the life level we experience, Newton is perfectly correct. About almost everything physical, from thermodynamics to Newton's law of cooling and whatnot. On a quantum level and on an astronomical level, on the far extremes of tiny small and hugely massive, he's actually wrong. So Einsteinian physics came along and unsettled Newton's science. Now, there are parts in which they can coexist, but the fact of the matter is, science is really a word for knowledge, and knowledge is always evolving. So I think what people really mean by science is not necessarily the word knowledge. It means provable, reproducible observations that accord with reality, and will happen independently of bias and magic in a way. So magic is not science. I can make almost anything happen magically. I mean, on this video, I could have antelopes walking behind me, and I could turn into it. I mean, with what you see this with some of the kids' apps, I could literally turn into the zebra or a giraffe or whatever as I'm talking to you. Now, does that mean I did? Well, that's magic, and so forth. So whenever something happens, you have to figure out how it happened and whether it can happen again in neutral circumstances. So that's what science is. So as far as this goes, Zika microcephaly, I've found a lot of resistance. So the concept that Zika may not have caused microcephaly, even though it hasn't caused microcephaly. Even in Brazil, the following year, there was no increase in microcephaly. There's been a fair amount of debate whether it caused microcephaly increase at all in the first place. And I think I showed some data previously. But when they did a retrospective and it kind of did a registry, they didn't find that 2015 had any more microcephaly in the general sense than 2014 and 2012. It was all about the same. So there was, and I'm not going to dispute that the doctors van der Linden saw what they saw, okay? But you can see something if you have 13 rainy days in a row. There were 13 rainy days in a row. Nobody's going to dispute that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that happened because of something bigger or nefarious or difficult or dangerous. It could be, it rained 13 days in a row. Some guy might, score 5 goals in 3 games. It doesn't mean the games were rigged. It might mean he's lucky, and if he scores 0 goals in the next 30 games, some things can just be the way things are happening. And so I think as far as I wrote about this topic a year ago, actually about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and I spent months, like 5-6 months, trying to get it published someplace in the United States, and and even in England and whatnot. I couldn't get it published in the medical journals, the newspapers, and so forth. And it's if you have a theory that's not the accepted theory at any given moment, even in a total absence of Zika causing microcephaly again in Brazil in 2016, or causing it in India in 2018, or causing it anywhere else where it's supposed to have taken over the world, especially the tropical countries. It's so the short answer is there should be something out there. Yeah, I don't want to make a science court, because that will be kind of taken over by certain interests, whatever people who think they know more. at the end of the day, it's good if people can debate and consider things and run ideas past each other, and then hopefully, there's enough independence in science, one place or another, one country or another, to wind up with different theories, and then the ability for people to hear it. But this is not as easy a task as I thought when I was a kid. I had this illusion that, scientists were, all kind of like, neutral skeptics. They're all Galileo and whatnot. But, to be fair, Galileo suffered for thinking what he thought. And, Einstein didn't meet with great success or favor for saying what he thought. He was ridiculed. And so, it takes a certain kind of persistence to change people's minds about things. And as far as an answer for that, if I come up with that, I'll let you know.
Okay, perfect. So for last question of today, okay, I want to ask you, what are the main differences between Zika then and now? Okay, you might have answered this question already, but I think as an overview, do you believe that Zika has mutated, evolved,
Right.
or we are dealing with something else and barking on around the wrong tree?
Well, so that's an excellent question. It's a little bit above my pay grade in the sense that I am not a virologist, I'm not a research scientist, and I'm not, despite my knowledge about all of this kind of like general stuff, I'm not a particular Zika genomic expert. So I can't tell you all of the genomic variations and whatnot. But I will say that there's been talk of the mutant strain of Zika, that because people have asked this question, like, what's up with that? Why didn't it cause it the next year? Why didn't it cause it anywhere else? I mean, these are pretty obvious questions. Again, we did the thing with having gravity go up. I have the same cup today. Just if we can try the theory again, if you come watch one of our previous videos, I had a theory that if I let go of something, it'll go up. And so we're going to test it out. Boom. Now it doesn't. And I can do it over and over again. It always drops down. Maybe that's magic. Maybe that's I video edited this. But you can probably test it at home. Just drop something and see what happens. So, I actually asked this question to Donald McNeil, who at the time was the chief science writer for the New York Times, which was influential not just in covering this story, but actually in creating the story. So there's a story within the story, and I recommend the book, not necessarily in the way that Donald McNeil might think, in glorifying the story, but I think it's an instructive story to see what a reporter can do outside of reporting per se, because there's a fair amount of arm twisting that went on from the New York Times and from certain places to get this, to have the urgency to circumvent the case control studies, to pressure the Bruce Aylwards and CDC, Bruce Aylward types of the world, to move on this, to get it done quickly, because lives are being lost. Kind of like the yell fire in a crowded theater effect. You can say, I'd like everyone to leave this movie because it's, not the movie that I really like. But as soon as you yell fire, everyone's out of there. And they don't have time to think. They're not going to think about whether you are right about the fire. They're going to do a lot of action. But in this particular case, I think there was too much urgency around it. Just give me the question again so I can follow up, see if I've missed any part of that.
Okay, so the question is, what are the main differences between Zika then and now about the disease, right, and how it's perceived?
Right. So I think that amongst the lay people, say, you'll have to tell me what people, think or act in Brazil. I can't imagine it's a big news story these days. I know there's some carryover, and there's some, monetary aspect for the women who had microcephalic babies and that were attributed to Zika. And so there's going to be some carryover on a low level, and people probably who have, birth defects and so forth are going to consider Zika, and there's probably testing for Zika more now than obviously there was then, because there was zero then. But around the world, I don't think Zika is an item. I don't think people have the capacity to consider everything when something is not an issue. But on a scientific basis, it hasn't caused microcephaly elsewhere. And then again, the question became, why is that? Well, maybe it's a different Zika. Maybe Brazil had this one particular version of Zika, and maybe that one didn't go to India. Maybe so they've looked at these mutant strains, and they found one which they thought maybe more neurotropic, to go into the brain and be able to cross the blood brain, the placental blood barrier between the mother and the embryo / fetus. But that has not been shown to carry through. That even where they've found, I think they've found some differences in some microbiological basis between different strains, and maybe difference be able to travel a certain way, but at the end of the day, the places where they've found even the mutant strain hasn't caused microcephaly later on, and in Brazil it would still be there and wouldn't cause the next year. So people said, oh well, in Brazil they didn't get it the next year because people were immune after the first year. They got so much Zika we didn't know about it, and so mothers were immune, and they might be showing up positive for Zika antibodies, but they're not really getting the illness during pregnancy, so it goes from a high amount to zero all of a sudden, which is pretty much what happened for the subsequent year. There was no rush of Zika microcephaly. So in my view, that at the very least, whether you believe it's true or not, would have to say, it's not really proven yet. And I'm okay with that. But nobody has retracted the theory and come to the kind of the realization that a lot of the origin story is a little bit like the Superman and the Batman and the Spider-Man stories that I loved as a kid. Again, I love the stories, don't get me wrong, but I don't go around thinking today that there's a guy around me who came from the planet Krypton who has superpowers and so, because I'm not a kid anymore. And I really love Batman, but I don't think there's Batman out there. And so when you have something that's sort of improbable, again, we all love magicians, and I think I know science and whatnot, but I go to see Penn and Teller, who are great magicians, and I'm still like, how did that just happen? And everybody loves that. I think you could take Albert Einstein, if he were alive, and Isaac Newton, bring the magic shows, they'd all be like, what just happened? That's incredible. And so, but I think there's a little bit of magic here with what happened. I think there was the magic moment of doctors finding something and then getting to, name that star, name that planet, name that crater. And they got their names attached to something that was there, or if it was there, was mild. And then something similar happened in a sense when people perceived a separate problem, then they attached them together. And I think it's an interesting magic trick in a way, and maybe it is more than a magic trick. Maybe it is actual science, but people have followed along and tried to prove it one way or another. And it's not to say Zika doesn't exist, because Zika is an actual virus, and it may very well, travel into certain of the babies, during incubation, birth, gestation, but it may not. And I don't think that has been really proved on an epidemiologic basis, and thank God for that, because we don't. It's one less thing to worry about. But it has taken time, and I personally, if it's not the case and it hasn't really been proven, people should say at the very least it's not really been proven yet. We are going to put this thing on hold or reserve until we figure it out and do case-controlled studies, which would be the proof. That even Donald McNeil in his book admits it was.
Okay, doctor. So those were all the questions that I had for you today. It kind of felt like I was taking medical classes, even for a lot that a law student could understand. I kind of said that I learned a lot. And thank you for today's episode.
All right, I appreciate that, Neto. I hope to see you soon, and I wish you continued luck and perseverance in the case of the COVID crisis in Brazil. You give my best to your family and friends, okay?
Okay, thank you very much, doctor.
Right. Bye-bye.
Your best as well. Bye.